Okay, I'm going to talk about pathogens. Pathogen is a microorganism that causes disease. There are a lot of microorganisms that don't cause disease. In fact, we have more of them, many more than we have cells in our body, living in us and on us right now. Bacteria, eukaryotic organisms, single-celled, archaea, and also an assortment of viruses. So not all microorganisms are bad for you, but of course some can harm you. Anybody remember West Nile virus a couple of years ago? I was living elsewhere, but I came down to a friend's house, and all of a sudden, I mean, squirrels were just falling out of the tree. It's amazing. So there was this epidemic, obviously, that was going through. It also decimated, like, the crow population, which he was kind of happy about, and all sorts of different things. So that's an example of, actually, it was a pandemic, because it spread all over the globe. So there's been epidemics and pandemics that have affected human beings in fact, human history, essentially. Probably the best known one that you might have heard of is bubonic plague in the 14th century in Europe. We can take a look at it. So, let's see. December 1347. Oh, yeah, okay. So it looks like it kind of started here and went up through here and then into France and part of the Iberian Peninsula and also Italy. Then the Alps, and then up into Germany and Netherlands. It also went over to Great Britain in a number of different waves. And then finally ended up, this area was actually a city or area partially or totally spared. Okay, and it looks like it actually came from perhaps China, but certainly from the Middle East, where it also wreaked havoc. But they don't have really the kind of statistics to look at or data. It killed probably half the population in Europe at the time. Now, 1400s or 1300s, 14th century, this was the late medieval period. It was feudal society. A feudal society meant that there were these landholders. They were usually knights who were kind of, their patron was the king. It was kind of a mutualistic, not so mutualistic relationship. But most of the people were serfs, and they actually were part of the land. In other words, they were owned, just like the land was owned. They were born, and they grew up, and they died as serfs. And this persisted for quite a while, but this was the beginning of the end, especially in Western Europe. When the plague came in, it wiped out so many people that suddenly labor was not cheap anymore. Before it was cheap labor, but now there was fewer people who could actually work. And the plague, by the way, killed indiscriminately, right? It wasn't a matter of, oh, this group died more than this group. If you were high-born or low-born, you were dead, often. There were whole villages and towns that were completely wiped out. Here. Yep, thanks. Completely wiped out. There are others, of course, that were partially spared. It was a fulminating febrile disease, so people might show the beginnings of signs in the morning and they'd be dead in the evening. Bubonic plague is mainly carried by fleas that are on rats, but there's some evidence that it might have been other rodents. And then there's also occasionally bubonic plague turns into a contagious disease by aerosols. Okay, so but anyway, a couple of years ago, they went to a town where there was a large grave where all these plague victims had been buried 600 years ago or more, and they actually got some plague bacteria, or at least the DNA from it, from the bones. And so people were wondering whether it was actually bubonic plague because it showed all the symptoms of it, or some other illness. And it was plague. And we'll look at the phylogeny in a bit. But it turns out also that, well, we'll do that as well. So let's see. This is Peter Bruegel, The Elder, The Triumph of Death. Pretty brutal. You can imagine if half the people you knew died. It'd be like, doomsday, right? It would freak everybody out. And it did, obviously. A lot of people thought it was God's wrath. That's what they usually think. So, of course, they killed a lot of people who weren't, let's say, Christians, Catholics. Those are the Jews and gypsies and things like that. They blame it on the scapegoat. But anyway, it's just, it's brutal. So, he was a Flemish painter. He was also very religious. In fact, he actually painted a lot of peasant life, which was unusual at the time. Okay. So there were basically 3 great plagues of bubonic plague. Let's see. Justinian, that's right. So there was, in the 6th century, this is the Justinian plague that wiped out, it was the end of the Roman Empire, so 500 AD, and the beginning of the medieval period. And it was a great pandemic. We don't have as much data, but they also sequenced that, and it was very closely related to the green one, which is the Black Death, the one in the 14th century. And then there was also one that came out of China in the 19th and 20th century. It wasn't as big. There was a plague outbreak in Chinatown in San Francisco, but it didn't carry and didn't kill as many people. Now, the thing is, it's a bacteria. Nowadays, if someone actually caught the plague, and it happens, if they got to a doctor and got antibiotics right away, they'd be fine. But you have to do it fast. And a lot of times most doctors will not recognize it as plague. They think it's just flu, and by that time, you could actually die. Around the Lake Tahoe area, there's kind of a circulating plague. It's been going on for years among chipmunks and ground squirrels and things like that. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, okay. There we go. So this is actually a phylogeny. And let's see. Okay, so some of these are randomized, and some, in other words, better data than others. Some are tip dated in terms of the actual time period. Here's the, you can see how, actually, it turns out that, let's see, I guess before the Justinian plague, plague didn't actually travel well among populations of rodents. But it picked up some new alleles that allowed it to travel easily. And that's when these big outbreaks happen. So this is an example of, evolution in action. Most of the plague strains that are circulating now are, well, most of them came out of, they're most closely related, I think, to the third pandemic. But there's not very much difference in terms of sequences in the bacteria between now and, let's say, back when the Black Death was kind of roaming around. Now, an epidemic is an outbreak of disease in a prescribed area, we'll say. So an example was Ebola virus that went through West Africa a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago. That's an epidemic. People were all freaked out because they thought it was going to turn into a global pandemic. So a pandemic is usually global or at least highly regional. Let's say you have a pandemic within mostly Asia. Okay? Now, so it's a fast-spreading, harmful, unexpected. The Spanish flu, that's where it first showed up. They also called it swine flu. Killed about 50 million people worldwide at the time. So 5% of the human population, which is significant, but not like the plague. But you can kind of see how it spread. It partially ended World War I. So just like the Black Death had a big effect on history, essentially terminating the medieval period, the Dark Ages, and after that it was the beginning of the Renaissance. Okay, so it had a huge effect in Europe. See, back then people didn't think anything changed. They were taught that God created all and things go on, and if you were born a serf, you're going to stay a serf. Well, of course, you couldn't really claim things didn't change anymore after the plague. It was pretty obvious that things had changed drastically. Okay, so it was a virus that was related to today's influenza, but it had a few allele changes. It's a virus that made it a lot more deadly. It included, it was still inhalation, right? You got it from, it was contagious, but it involved a lot more organ systems, and so that's why it was so deadly. They actually sequenced this also. They went up to the Arctic in Alaska, and it spread up to there, and they found an old graveyard, and all these people had died from the flu, and they sequenced that as well. So I have a pretty good idea of actually what strain was actually causing it. And I don't know how many genes there are, maybe 25 or 50 genes, something like that, in the virus. They actually figured out where the differences were and perhaps what genes had an effect of making it a lot more virulent than a normal kind of flu virus. Okay. This is an influenza virus. And in fact, this is actually the variant that caused the swine flu. There's all these, let's see, there's a lipid envelope. There's also two different, there's an RNA protein, and then there's these, what are they called? They kind of allow the virus to get into another cell because they bind to certain sites on the cell. So, pathogen is any disease-causing organism. An organism, obviously there has to be a host. So the individual who contracts the pathogenic disease is the host. Sometimes the disease kills the person, sometimes it makes them sick. There are non-pathogenic diseases that infect people and don't cause any disease, but they still infect people. Okay? A good example is the simian deficiency virus, which is what HIV was descended from. It actually crossed the species barrier and went from chimps to humans in Africa because they ate a lot of bushmeat. And in chimps, they don't show any symptoms even though they're actually circulating viral particles in their bloodstream. In humans, obviously, that's not the case. So it has to be, an infection has to be pathogenic to cause actually an infection, a disease. And then in terms of transmission, there's different ways that a pathogen can be transmitted. It can be contagious, let's say by breathing in and out of the air, the viral particles can, or the, not just the viral, but bacteria or whatever, can exist outside the body for at least a period of time. It might have to do with touching or surfaces that have the virus or the bacteria on it. It might be a foodborne. Now, foodborne illnesses are not considered contagious, but it's the same thing. But mainly contagious means sharing between individuals, either through the air, surfaces, or semen or blood, something like that. Depending on the virus, some, or pathogen, some are highly contagious and others are much harder to get. So we'll look at that in a second. This is a bacteria. It's a deadly pathogen, but it's not very contagious. And it's only if you get it, the kind into your lungs, that it's actually deadly. It oftentimes causes a skin outbreak and is easily treated then. It's mainly a disease of farm animals because it has these spores that remain in the soil and they can then pick it up. Way back when World Trade Center was bombed, where they flew the planes into it, someone also started sending out anthrax letters to various congressmen. A couple people died. They finally figured out it was a microbiologist at one of the government research labs. Anthrax also was, there's a famous microbiologist named Louis Pasteur, who was one of the people who demonstrated and got data on the germ theory of disease. Okay? Now, just so you know, up until, probably the late 19th century, late 1800s, the general idea about disease was called the miasma hypothesis. It came all the way back from the Greeks, and miasma means like bad air. In fact, malaria, mal-aria, mal is bad, aria, is, bad air. It's usually in very tropical, wet climates. And the United States used to have it too until it was eradicated, but it was always outbreaks in the South. So this miasma theory was basically what people thought about how people got diseases. And there was this whole idea of people had different humors. And I think I went over this earlier, but like blood and bile and various other humors that had to be in balance. And that's why they frequently bled people. That usually made them sicker. So it really wasn't until people started getting a handle, an idea on infectious microbes. Now, there was even some Greeks back then who suggested that it might be something we couldn't see in terms of something very small. But no one really paid that much. It was lost in the medieval period. And then there was a guy actually in the 16th century, I guess, in Italy, who suggested it, the same thing. Edward Jenner, who did the vaccination for smallpox, that added more data to the fact that it wasn't just, bad air. So this is a contagious, we'll say, disease. Inhalation, contact with contaminated items, bodily fluids, those sorts of things. Usually, the less contagious something is, the less virulent it is. Or, no, sorry, it's the other way around. So the more contagious something is, the less virulent it is. We'll look at a graph on that, and I'll explain to you why. So you can also, contagious pathogens, ingest pathogens from one person to the next, that sort of thing. Now there's, ingestion, these are non-contagious pathogens, actually. They're spread through the environment, let's say by spores, like anthrax is hard to get. Salmonella causes, let's see, I think it's not cholera, it's typhoid fever, one form of typhoid fever. Transmission by an intermediate host, a vector. So malaria, well, I just said it. Malaria is an example of a vector-borne disease. This here in the bottom actually shows a tick. Ticks are notorious for carrying diseases, and when they bite people, they transmit it. Okay, that's right. Zoonotic diseases. I forgot about that. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that are transmitted from one animal or one organism to humans. Okay, there's a lot of them. Flu, rabies, all kinds of different things that are transmitted that way. More virulent, it's usually going to put someone down. They're not going to be walking around. So pathogens that are more virulent tend to not be transmitted contagiously because people aren't transmitting it from one person to the next. Or they are, but to a lesser degree, like Ebola is a contagious disease, but it's not like, let's say, flu or measles or something like that. You have to come in contact with bodily fluids. Now they're shedding virus like crazy, but there's no aerosol or anything like that going on. So it's a lot harder to transmit, okay? But if you, let's say, have a disease that, like flu, that doesn't put people down, maybe for a few days, but you can walk around and spread it very easily. You need someone to spread it, or the actual outbreak is going to die. So usually when you have a very virulent, now virulence is the ability to cause disease and the degree to which you have symptoms and mortality and all that. In general, airborne is usually less virulent because you need people to walk around. Vector-borne pathogens can be very virulent. Think of malaria. When you get malaria, you're not walking around, but you don't need to. You got mosquitoes coming in and biting you and then transmitting it to someone else. In fact, the malarial parasite actually affects the behavior of the mosquito. Mosquitoes zoom in on persons because they're very, they can determine carbon dioxide levels, and we're always breathing out carbon dioxide. Well, it turns out mosquitoes that have been infected with malaria parasite naturally go to other infected people. I mean, they'll find someone else and pass it along, but so in terms of going to infected individuals, they're more likely to pick it up and transmit it along the chain. Okay, so vector-borne diseases tend to be very virulent. A lot of the tick-borne diseases that we see, there's one, tularemia, it's called rabbit fever, Lyme disease. Now, Lyme disease is fairly virulent, but it takes time to actually do its work, and you can treat it with antibiotics. But a lot of tick-borne diseases are very virulent. Now, there's also foodborne and waterborne pathogens. There's I think it's a virus or a bacteria that's been creating big outbreaks on cruise ships. So whole cruise ships, someone has it, brings it on, whatever, and it just goes through everybody on the ship because they're all eating the same food and they all come down sick. It's usually you don't die from it, but it spreads very, very quickly. Now there's a lot of food and waterborne diseases that are really deadly. The most famous one, I don't know if you've heard of it, is called cholera. And it actually hangs out a lot of times in shellfish. There's now a big cholera epidemic still in Haiti. There was another one a couple of years ago in South America. I think it was Peru or Bolivia or something like that. The officials there said, "Oh, don't worry about it," because they didn't want to lose tourist dollars. And so the president actually went up and said, "See, I can eat all this stuff," and he did, and then he came down with cholera a couple of days later. So cholera kills people because it dehydrates them. So usually to survive it, you need a way to hang on to fluids, and basically what cholera does is it flushes out, it makes the gut system flush out all the bacteria and other microbes in the gut. So it only has it itself to compete with. Okay? Now when it does that, the body isn't uptaking enough water and fluids, and so they get dehydrated. If you put someone on an IV drip of saline solution, they're going to feel terrible, but they'll probably survive. There's also something called rehydration salts that they use, where you can mix some sugar and some salt and water in a certain mixture, kind of like Gatorade, right? And it's able to actually cross into the intestinal wall, and you can oftentimes survive by that way. But cholera is famous for killing, tons and tons and tons of people. Okay. Types of pathogens. There are eukaryotic pathogens. So remember, this is basically generally a eukaryotic cell, right? These are bacteria. These are rod-shaped. These are cocci. There's some viruses that are usually much smaller. So we'll take a look at, okay. eukaryotic pathogens. Some are worms, so they're multicellular. Some are single-celled, yeast. This is another eukaryotic pathogen, Giardia, that infects the stomach from drinking tainted water. You could, in the past, I don't know, 40 years ago, you could drink the water anywhere in the Sierras or the Rockies or anything like that. Unfortunately, since then, it's all been infected by cows with Giardia. So now when you're in the Sierras, you see this beautiful water flowing in a stream, and you still have to treat it or use a filter. So malaria is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's actually a pathogen. It goes through a life cycle and changes shape. So in this form, it's infecting red blood cells. It also then eventually bursts out of these blood cells and goes to the liver, where it then turns into kind of a different kind of pathogen, and finally it gets to the reproductive stage. Now, we've already talked a little bit about this, but individuals who have, let's see, I wish this was working. Okay. These HbA, these produce normal red blood cells. HbA, HbS, these are heterozygotes. Remember about that? So a heterozygote has two different alleles. Homozygote means they have the same allele. This is the heterozygote. This form is actually resistant to malaria, but it doesn't carry oxygen nearly as well. But it's still enough so that if you're in a malarial zone, you're going to survive, where all the normal type red blood cell people will die. And then HbS, HbS, these are sickle cell people. Oh. What's that?
It was autocorrect.
Oh, it did? Oh, yeah. Oh, damn them. Okay. Oh, yes, it did. Hey, you can't do that. Bastard. Okay. Now, we talked about this a bit earlier. This is called heterozygote advantage, when the heterozygote has higher fitness than either of the homozygotes. It's also called heterozygote superiority. Okay? It's one of those things, in this case, the heterozygotes, when you're in a malarial zone, have the highest fitness by far. People who have HbS, of course, they get sickle cell anemia. They don't produce offspring. People who get malaria, their fitness is certainly diminished because they might die from it. Okay. Now, bacteria, very common pathogens. They cause all sorts of diseases, like bubonic plague is Yersinia pestis, syphilis, staphylococcus, all kinds of different diseases. Some are serious, some aren't. These are cocci, round. This one is a rod-shaped one with a flagella, so it can propel itself. This is a spirochete, and this is a rod-shaped bacterium. Now, bacteria in our intestines are symbiotic. They have a nice place to live. They produce vitamins. They actually break down some material that we can't do ourselves, so we can actually get more nutrients. And then they don't cause disease. They actually interact, though, with our gut. So early on, usually infants get some of their original immunity from their mothers, but their infants are very susceptible. But then in terms of food, they start populating their gut with bacteria. And those bacteria and then the cells in the gut, through a bunch of genetic interactions, kind of become one organism. So people who don't have, or they've done it with mice, you get rid of the gut bacteria in mice, and they lose weight like crazy because they can't get as much nutrients out of the food. Obviously, we use bacteria for some of our food, cheese and yogurt. We also use some like yeast, which are eukaryotics, to make beer and bread and things like that. There's also some oil-eating bacteria. It hasn't been really all that useful. Okay, now one of the things that bacteria do that's threatening is they release toxins. Typhoid fever is like that. And some of the toxins, by the way, are they have neurology effects, okay, neurosystem effects. Another one is Clostridium tetani, causes lockjaw. You've probably heard of botulism. People use Botox to make their skin tight. That's the toxin. It's actually a very kind of serious toxin. I forget where I heard it, but people were actually thinking, well, maybe I should, we'll get to that. We'll actually, let's say, transmit genes that make botulinum toxin into our own cells so that we don't have to go for new Botox shots all the time. I thought that's pretty cool because it'll probably kill the person because they'll get, they'll be dead from too much Botox. So I think that's not a bad trade-off. Bacteria, they're much more likely to rapidly divide and make more themselves in warmer environments. So that's why we refrigerate things. Now, that's not always true. There are some bacteria that, let's say, live actually in glaciers, but they reproduce very, very, very slowly. Now, I have a video. Okay. Antibiotic resistance, we've already learned a lot about that. So, in terms of antibiotic resistance, how do bacteria become antibiotic resistant, anybody? Do they get, let's say, non-random mutations that, like a whole bunch of them just turn into antibiotic-resistant bacteria? Or are they born that way? Like, are some bacteria, some are resistant, some aren't, right? The ones that are resistant, that's actually the way it happens. The ones that have the resistant phenotype, they survive. The ones that aren't, don't, right? So that's how antibiotic resistance actually manages to overcome antibiotics. It's a nice little trick, and it's one of the problems that we have because antibiotics aren't real profitable for the pharmaceutical companies. So the government pays a lot of pharmaceutical companies to actually make them, but there hasn't been much research on new antibiotics, and so we're kind of running out of the things that work. We can actually, let's see if I can find that. That's kind of why when you get prescribed antibiotics, remember they only work on bacteria, certain bacteria. You have to take the full course, because if you don't, and you have a mutant, even one that's slightly resistant and it survives the antibiotic, it will make up the population, the future population. So let's say after 2 days you're feeling better, and you stop taking it, and lo and behold, you end up with an infection that's antibiotic resistant. Okay, viruses. Viruses are the perfect parasite. We can say pathogen too, but they're a parasite. What a parasite does is usually parasites are simpler, and they live off of a host. They don't necessarily kill a host. Viruses have taken it to the nth degree where they don't even have a cell. They use cellular machinery that they infect to make more copies of themselves. There's all kinds. Some infect plants, animals, bacteriophage, like the one on the lower right, infects bacteria, a virus that infects bacteria. And we talked about this earlier. CRISPR, that gene editing technique, is actually based on the bacterial defense against viruses. Okay. This is kind of what happens. We have a virus that enters the cell by injecting its RNA or DNA. In this case, it's an RNA virus, and then it's transcribed into DNA. This DNA then is translated into various proteins that the virus uses, like the protein cap on the outside, so that it can gain entry to cells and leave cells like that. And then, of course, it starts producing new viral particles. Okay. Viruses attack the membranes of the respiratory tract. Measles viruses actually infect immune cells in the lung, which are then spread around the body. The immune system tends to transmit information about, what it's come across, and but it's not it kills a lot of the memory cells, which we'll get into, but it's not like HIV, which completely destroys the immune system. Rabies is a neurological virus. Many viruses are cell-specific. Some are species-specific. Oh, I know, I forgot something earlier. Hold on. So this is a virus actually infecting a bacteria, and you can see the little viruses all the way around it. And bacteria have actually evolved a way that has an adaptive immune system, which we'll get to, where the bacteria recognizes a virus that tried to infect it before, or its lineage, and then once it detects that it's been infected before, it's got this enzyme that chops the virus up into little pieces. Now, we haven't really talked about this too much, but viruses can also cause cancer. if you think about it, viruses are taking their genetic material, inserting it into a cell's genome, transcribing, and you can see, since cancer is essentially a molecular genetic process, no matter how it happens, whether it's a carcinogen in the atmosphere, UV rays hitting the skin cells, something like that, it causes changes at that level. So there's a relative of HIV that actually causes non-lymphoma Hodgkin's disease, or lymphoma, I forget. Anyway, it causes a blood cancer. There's also HPV. We talked a little bit about this. It infects, it's a sexually transmitted disease. It causes genital warts. There's a vaccine out now for it, but it's not really heavily used because a lot of religious people think, well, if I give it to my daughter, that means I'm saying you can go become, you can sleep around as much as you want, and so I won't give it to her, and so instead she gets cervical cancer and dies. Mm-hmm. That's okay. That's natural selection at work. Okay. And guys should also, by the way, get it too. You can get it from oral sex. There are some viruses that are latent. They hang out in the immune system, in the body, but they don't cause any disease. Chickenpox is a good example. Get it usually when you're young. It actually travels up the nervous system and hangs out in the nervous system for years and years. And then oftentimes when someone is older or stress or something that kind of is immunosuppressive, it often then comes back in the form of what's called shingles. HIV nowadays, there's this 3-drug cocktail that treats it. It's actually it means that the virus is actually latent, hanging out in immune cells, but it's not causing disease per se. So there's no circulating virus in the bloodstream. So here's AIDS. Helper T cells are infected, and then the virus actually, along with our own immune system, basically destroys those cells. And so a big part of our immune system is completely wiped out. And that's why people die of opportunistic infections, whether it's Kaposi sarcoma, a kind of pneumonia, all kinds of different things. So it can't be transmitted by kissing or sneezing or coughing, primarily by sex, and if you're a junkie, by needles. HIV, I mentioned this. HIV is it's an RNA virus. So the nuclear material is RNA, not DNA. DNA is a lot more stable because you got complementary base pairing, right? RNA doesn't have that, and so they usually generate higher mutation rates. And that's been really the problem in terms of getting a vaccine that'll actually work on AIDS. There's so many mutation rates, kind of like the flu vaccine also, that you really can't get a vaccine that'll work very long. They're still trying. They might eventually manage it, but at this point, not so much. Okay. So, by the way, HIV evolves. It actually evolves inside the body. So you have different populations of HIV viruses, some in the spleen, some in white blood cells in the in the blood system, and they're each slightly different because they live in different environments. Okay, so nowadays you probably heard that there's a drug cocktail. They use 3 different drugs that actually target different pathways in the viral life cycle. One of them targets this RNA replicase enzyme that then turns the material into DNA and then inserting it into the genome. So one targets that, another targets another part of the life cycle. It's been very effective. Before that, there was only one drug, and patients would get better, and then after that, they'd usually have the end of remission, and then they die. When it first came out, AIDS was a death sentence. Everybody died. They didn't die from the virus. They died from all these opportunistic diseases that normally are in us, but our immune system keeps them at low levels. Okay. Okay. It's interesting, there's this mutation that was actually found in Europeans that makes it so the virus cannot attach to any of the immune cells, and so those people are actually immune to getting attacked by HIV. I'm sure there's a similar mutation in African populations. Wherever you find it, there's going to be probably some mutation that makes people resistant, like the heterozygote advantage that we looked at in terms of malaria. So there's this stretch of DNA that's actually been deleted, and the HIV-infected person, the normal virus can't attach to the cells, and so they can't infect the person. And then there's some really terrible diseases like Ebola. It's called a filovirus. There's a bunch of different ones. They create a hemorrhagic fever where people start bleeding from everywhere. It's a god-awful disease. You've probably heard about, the West African one. It kind of burned through West Africa. Well, it took about a year for it to finally subside. So there's some people who obviously who survived it and were resistant to it after that, and it didn't have enough hosts to then spread to new people. But in the meantime, it killed a lot of people. And it created, multi-organ failures. It's really a horrible disease. Luckily, it doesn't last long. So, it'll probably kill you in a couple of days. Oh, and finally, there's not all pathogens are actually microbial. There's this what are called prion diseases. Prions are misfolded proteins, and when they come in contact with normal tissue, they make those proteins misfold too. So they're not common. They can be transmitted. Let's say there's infected neurological tissue, whether it's brain or spinal cord, and then it can infect other people. So there was something called mad cow disease a number of years ago. Now they have a whole bunch of things they do so that they make sure if a mad cow starts exhibiting the symptoms, neurological symptoms, they usually take it out and they test it. So mad cow disease happened previously. Usually it's neurological, and people just come apart at the seams in terms of destroying brain tissue and stuff like that. It was first discovered, their prion diseases were first discovered in New Guinea by this guy named, I think his name was Gandrazak. He was a microbiologist. He actually showed that this was a new kind of disease that was spread by a kind of mutant protein and not by a microbial infection. And he also got a Nobel Prize. But there's this group of New Guinean tribesmen, and one of their practices was cannibalism. But it was not the kind where you go out and you kill someone else and then eat his brains and everything because you want to gain his powers. It was more like you're eating your dead relatives. They die, eat brain tissue, they get the disease. Now, of course, the New Guinea Highlanders who got this, they didn't know this. So it was mainly women and children who ate the infected tissue. Muscle material and other organs were not infected with that, and the men usually ate that. So when Ganderzak actually discovered it, they finally managed to get those people to realize that it was their practices in terms of eating their dead, and they stopped it, and that was the end of it. But people within a couple of months of infection it was kind of like mad cow disease. There's also another one called fatal familial insomnia, where people can't go to sleep. That doesn't last long before it kills you, you can imagine, and it's probably a horrible. Okay. I don't care.
Okay. So, right now, my immune system is in full gear. It's trying to keep me alive. 50-50. First of all, we have an immune system that's innate and adaptive. And what that means is there's an overall immune system that doesn't really matter what's attacking us. It's just generalized. So when you get, let's say, a cold, one of the first things that starts happening is a release of histamine, which is part of the immune system. So you're pouring stuff out of your nose and your sinuses and all that. Innate immunity includes physical barriers like your skin, biochemical like histamine and a bunch of other stuff. Some immune cells that just recognize anything as non-self. And then also a whole bunch of microbes that actually protect us from other microbes. So like our gut bacteria generally protect us from a whole bunch of pathogens that could get in there, but there's no real room for them. So there's this part of the innate system. Now, there's also an adaptive immune system. And what that means is that our immune systems and our immune system cells actually evolve. Now, I told you that individuals don't evolve early in the semester. Well, I was lying. Our immune system evolves by remembering all the different pathogens that infected it previously. You might remember bacteria have this CRISPR-Cas system that I mentioned that is now used in gene editing. Well, bacteria actually have an adaptive immune system, like we do. And it's almost better than what we have. in the sense that the whole lineage, remember, bacteria reproduce asexually. They make clones of themselves, right? So if you take that clone lineage and stretch back in time, it will remember basically all the viruses that attacked it. And it has an immune system that will chop up those viruses. We have something similar, but it's a little bit more complicated, but at the basis, it's about the same thing. So, in terms of the innate skin, cilia, which are these little things in on our lung cells that clear mucus. Here's the saliva, our antimicrobial, and then a fever response is actually us, our immune system, trying to kill the bacteria or the viruses. So, fever, by raising our temperature, actually kills bacteria and viruses and other microbial pathogens like molds and fungi and things like that. And so oftentimes you get a fever when you get attacked with something that is actually a good thing. It may make you feel terrible, but it's actually protecting you. There's a whole bunch of immune cells that protect us. Some of them are memory cells. And B cells and T cells. Now there's also killer T cells, so for now we're just talking about memory cells. These are cells that are specifically looking out for certain antigens from previous infections. If we didn't have these, we'd have to mount an immune response from scratch instead of already having something in place that lets us get on any sort of invasion by a pathogen, okay? Now, one of the things that B cells do is, and these T cells, is they have antibodies. These are proteins that lock on to any antigen. And an antigen can be a protein on a bacteria's coat or a virus's coat, anything like that, that the system then recognizes. So B cells release these when they come in contact with something that is pretty similar to what was an infection before. They release these antibodies that glom onto the bacteria or the virus, and then those are going to be destroyed by killer T cells. Okay, so these are a bunch of different antigens that glom onto bacteria. Now, B and T cells are produced in the bone marrow, and they're multipotent. Anybody remember what multipotent means? Compared to pluripotent. Anything? Okay. You guys are going to do great on the next test. Multipotent means that they're limited in the kind of cells they can become. So they're stem cells, but unlike pluripotent stem cells that can become any kind of cell, multipotent are strictly for adult stem cells. So they can be different kinds of T cells and B cells as part of the immune system. The first time we're exposed to a foreign substance or adaptive immune system, the response is slow. For subsequent exposures, it's fast because it's got a memory of those previous infections. And in fact, that's the basis for vaccination. We get a vaccine to basically teach us, our immune system, that, oh, this is foreign and that you should attack it anytime it comes along in the future. That's why vaccines actually work. Now, anybody know what the first vaccine was for? Close, but smallpox. In fact, Edward Jenner, who was an English physician, was the first to recognize, but people had kind of recognized it beforehand, that there was a related disease called cowpox that people who work with cattle often got. Not serious, but it would protect people from smallpox. Now, this had been somewhat known all the way back into antiquity, in terms of the Greeks and the Romans, and the Turks during the Ottoman Empire. They would oftentimes take someone who was sick with smallpox. They'd take a pustule, collect a little bit of stuff, and then vaccinate someone with it. And, they're basically inoculating someone with fresh smallpox. Well, that often, the mortality for that was low, maybe 2%. So 2% of the people who got that died. So it wasn't really a vaccine, but a lot more people were, after that, immune to smallpox, which often had a mortality rate of 40%. So Jenner was the first to realize that if you took cowpox and you vaccinated someone with that, they would be immune to smallpox, a related virus. So that was the first vaccine. Vaccines are now either used, they use either dead viruses or they use weakened viruses, or more recently, they just engineer an antigen, which is the part of the virus that the immune system recognizes, and gives that as the vaccine. Okay? So all it's doing is kind of cueing the immune system so that anytime a future pathogen like that comes along, the immune system will destroy it immediately. So an antigen is a particular foreign protein. Usually it has to do with the coat around a bacteria or a protein around a virus. Now, you probably wonder, okay, then how come we have to have a new flu vaccine every year? I already had my flu shot, so I know I don't have the flu. I have a cold, but flu virus mutates very rapidly. And at any one time, there's many strains of flu running around. So what happens is each year, the government and some labs keep track of what's circulating, and then they create a multi-flu vaccine that recognizes the most common types that are circulating at that time. There are some years when the flu vaccine does not work well, like not this year, but a couple years ago, there was a vaccine that was almost completely ineffective because what was circulating at that time was something different. Now, when a mutation comes along in terms of a flu virus, remember, mutations can have very little effect. They can have a bad effect, or they can have a beneficial effect. From the virus's perspective, if it changes the protein code so that the immune systems of all potential victims don't recognize it anymore, that's a beneficial mutation. So that's exactly what happens. Most of the mutations for that virus are not going to be worth anything, but some will, and those will make up the dominant flu strain for the next round. Now, when you get a mutation that then changes the virus, that's called antigenic drift. So, in other words, the altered virus is no longer recognized by the adaptive immune system as having previously caused flu. Now, there's something else that can happen, and it's called antigenic shift, different than drift. Let's say you have two different viral particles, and they each invade a cell, and then, because they're both involved in a cell, and remember, viruses release their either DNA or RNA to make copies of themselves by using the cell itself, they kind of recombine and reassort, and you end up with a virus that now kind of combines the DNA from previous viruses into one. So this virus has two different antigens instead of just one. So this creates a different viral strain. So this is called antigenic shift. It's not caused by a new mutation. It's caused by a reassortment of two different strains coming together and forming a new strain. There was something I mentioned earlier about zoonotic. So a zoonotic disease is a disease that jumps from one organism to another. In this case, from an animal to another animal, in other words, from some other animal to us. So one of the primary hosts of flu is actually birds. And so avian flu is usually the source of all new viral flu strains. These different antigens include an N protein that helps the virus get out of a cell. These are blue. And a yellow protein, hemagglutinin, that helps the virus get into a cell. Both of these can be recognized by the immune system. So, in terms of antigenic drift and antigenic shift, one is by mutation and one is mixing of different viral strains. So you might end up with a new recombinant virus that have new properties that allow it to do things that normally it didn't do in the past, like perhaps infect, besides lung cells, other cells in the body. So the flu virus of 1918 that actually caused a pandemic and killed about 50 million people worldwide, was due to antigenic shift. And they know this because they recovered virus from a grave full of people who died from this flu. It was actually up in the Arctic, in the Inuit village. And so they recovered it, and they looked, and they realized that it was a combination of two different strains that were circulating previously. Okay. Now, there's been a fair amount of misinformation that's going on with the measles vaccine. As you know from reading, measles causes autism. No, it doesn't. Anybody remember what's a correlation? Correlation? Anything? Remember from way back in the first lecture? Correlation, the scientific method? Okay. A correlation is an association between either negative or positive, like as something goes up, something else goes up, that they're only associated for some other reason, but one doesn't cause the other. Okay, that's what a correlation is. When does autism first show up? What time of life? Autism.
In their 40s or older?
Autism? No. Little babies. Yeah. Schizophrenia shows up in their 20s. Okay, but autism, young. When do people get a measles vaccine? When they're young, right? Okay. So at the time, there was, some people thought, well, maybe measles vaccine, MMR, which is measles, mumps, and rubella, maybe that causes autism. Somehow, a paper by this English physician got published, and it was bogus. He made up his data, all sorts of shit. Well, it's been having a bad effect ever since, in that it seemed to report that there was cause and effect. There wasn't. It was strictly a spurious correlation. They both show up at the same time. Getting a vaccine and getting autism. Autism usually involves a whole bunch of new mutations as an embryo is developing. In other words, during development, cells are undergoing mitosis at a very rapid rate. That's the source of mutations. Okay. Anyway, now there's this whole to-do about a bunch of people, you really can't talk to them using reason because they're terrified of their children getting autism. So unfortunately, kids that don't get vaccine, it'd be one thing if it only affected them, the kids, right? They get measles and they die. Wouldn't that be great? Those people wouldn't be breeding into the future. All their offspring would die because they wouldn't get autism, but they would, die of measles. Autism and measles have nothing to do with each other. Okay, but unfortunately, a vaccine works because of something called herd immunity. Okay, what that means is, let's say you get to a point of about 90% immunity, where 90% of the people have been vaccinated. It means that there's very few susceptible people out there to carry an infection, right? There's only 10% versus 100% susceptible. So it's very unlikely, with 90% vaccinated, that you're going to get, let's say, a measles infection or a smallpox infection or numerous other vaccines. So not only does it protect the people who get vaccinated, but it protects a whole bunch of other people too, including people who have an immune system that's been suppressed for one reason or another. Maybe they're transplant patients and they take these immune suppressing drugs. Maybe they have some certain kinds of cancer that depress the immune system. So it protects all those people as well. So you're not just essentially protecting your own kid, you're protecting a lot of other people. And then there's something else that's going on. Measles, what kind of cells do measles attack? Well, they actually attack immune cells. They specifically attack the B and T memory cells that are the basis for recognizing past infections. They used to think that once a person got measles, that the effect lasted for maybe 1 or 2 months, and then they got all their memory cells back. It's not the case. It pretty much wipes out your memory cells for all your previous infections for, probably at least 3 or 4 years. Okay, in other words, from the time a baby comes along until, let's say, eventually getting infected with measles, any past infections that it survived, it is now susceptible to all over again. So let's take a look at this. This figure is measles incidence, in other words, the number of cases of measles. So measles incidence, non-measles infectious disease mortality. In other words, other infectious diseases, and then measles-induced immunomodulation. In other words, measles destroys the immune memory cells. So let's take a look at this. Okay. On the left here, non-measles infectious disease mortality per 100,000 person years. That's this line. And then, on the other axis, annual measles incidence per 100,000 years. Oops. Okay. Now, 3 places. So, here we have non-measles induced mortality. Here we have incidence of measles. Right here is when people got vaccinated with the measles vaccine in the 60s. And then in Denmark a little bit later. And if you actually look at things, as measles incidence, here it is right here, goes up and down, you get the same sort of thing with mortality. That means there's all this extra mortality for kids, primarily because they're getting measles, which destroys their immune system, and so after that, they get infected with the kinds of things they got infected before, but it might be a different strain. So let's say you got one strain of flu that a kid caught. That was pretty mild. But another strain came along that the immune system should have recognized, but it's a lot more virulent, kills the kid. And so kids who were not vaccinated are suddenly susceptible to dying anyway, not from measles, but to other sources of other pathogens. Okay? So I just want you guys to understand that if you ever have kids of your own, by the way, kids will probably kill you prematurely, but just so you know. If you ever have kids of your own, get them vaccinated. If they get measles, they might have a higher chance of dying than if they got the measles vaccine and were protected. Okay. Okay. Number of pirates. Yeah, temperature. There was, for a while there was a negative correlation between as the temperature increased, the number of pirates decreased. So like that. So these are pirates, and this is temp. Okay? That's a correlation. Does temperature cause pirates or piracy? It does, actually, yeah. Yeah, it has a lot to do with pirates. Pirates don't like cold temperatures, and so they're not around. But when there's lots of high temperatures, they love that, because then they can drink grog to their heart's content and not worry about freezing in the snowbank. So it's really important for pirates to have a nice warm temperature. Does that sound plausible? You guys are not really worth much today, are you? You must be feeling under the weather. Okay. Okay, and then one final thing. Autoimmune diseases. An autoimmune disease is a disease actually caused by your own immune system. That means the immune system that you have is actually attacking you. There's a lot of question about what starts this kind of reaction. One hypothesis is that, let's say, a bacterial or viral infection starts an immune response, and then the immune response is not turned off properly. Now, when I talked about earlier about cancer, cancer has an ability to suppress the immune system around cancer cells. Actually, all our cells have that ability, okay? So there's this very kind of modulation that's going on between our immune system and our self, recognizing self, not attacking self, but maintaining immunity. And it not only does it have to do with the immune system cells, but it also has to do with the cells of our self that release chemical that use other cells to protect itself. Okay. Sometimes that goes haywire and the immune system starts attacking itself. One of the most common autoimmune diseases is multiple sclerosis, which attacks the myelin sheath that goes around all our nerve cells. Another one is type 1 diabetes that usually strikes individuals when they're young. It kills all the beta cells that make insulin in our pancreas. A ton more. Rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease. Just about any kind of cell in our body can be subject to an autoimmune disease. There's another hypothesis out there that our gut bacteria actually train, or our gut microbes, not just bacteria, but also bacteria, fungi, viruses, things like that, actually train our early immune system when we're infants. And by being brought up in a overly clean environment, we're actually doing our kids a disservice. So if you have kids, let them eat dirt. At this point, usually when people get an autoimmune disease, another one is lupus, connective tissue. When people get an autoimmune disease, usually they treat it with powerful immune suppressing drugs. And so, which have a lot of bad side effects, in addition to making those people susceptible to all sorts of diseases that you normally wouldn't get.